All right, welcome back. Continuing talking about the Penguins and the Rangers tomorrow, Game 4. And before I get into what's going to happen next, I want to ask Josh, you'll start this segment about Tristan Jarry. He was on the ice. Is there a chance he comes back? Because nobody's saying much about him, other than he's day-to-day, which means in hockey terms, who knows?
Well, I have to think there's a chance. He did not skate today, but apparently that was the plan. They wanted him on the ice Saturday morning, skated for a while, looked pretty good. Day off today. I suspect he will skate tomorrow. If he's not on the ice tomorrow, then you know he's not playing in this series. Right?
Am I insane for saying I would not just put him back in?
Well, just look at last year as an example. He had missed time, right?
I mean, I understand that we're dealing with a guy who
you're going to run on Louis Domingue, no matter what.
Well, not no matter what, but I'm just saying. I think it depends on.
Unless Domingue really falls apart, I would not play Jarry this series.
Well, if
he's cleared to play,
I would not. I don't think he would be cleared
to play.
But if he is, I mean, the series is over in a week.
I go with Jarry the second he's cleared to play myself. And that's not a knock on Louis. It's a great story. He's given you everything he's got, but the talent discrepancy is pretty large.
What about lack of time? No minor league game to rep in, no hard practice.
I understand that, and it's not ideal, but I still think you got to go with your guy. And I don't know how much longer this guy's going to keep beating the best goalie in the world. I don't know.
Well, heck, you got Alex DiOrio ready. He's sitting there. He's played, right?
Have you seen his numbers in Wheeling this year?
If Jarry went in, I'm very rarely the negative person, but if he went in and played poorly off the injury, I think it creates all kinds of questions again this offseason about whether or not he's built to win in the playoffs. And it would be a tougher evaluation because you could say, well, was it the psyche or was it the foot that caused him to play poorly?
So as Josh mentioned, Jarry did not skate today. So he's got to put at least 3-4 days on the ice together, seeing shots.
I would think so.
That gets you to Friday.
His first game's Game 7. No way.
There's no way he plays. There's no way he plays tomorrow. There's no way he plays in Game 5 in New York. I don't think. The earliest I would guess would be Game 6, which would be Friday night back in Pittsburgh. But
if they're up 3-2,
which is an elimination game for someone.
Well, if they're down 3-2, I think they go to him if he's ready. Put it that way. If Domingue loses 4 and 5 and Jarry can play in 6, you have to play.
That would be a no-brainer.
But what if he's up 3-2 and he's coming off a good game?
Mike Sullivan tends to go with the guy. Wouldn't Mike Sullivan tend to go with Jarry?
I think so.
I mean, based on how he handles that kind of
thing. And listen, like I said, Louis is a great story. He has given up 9 goals in the last 2 games.
I think Sullivan's a tremendous coach. But one of the things about him in the last couple of years that has bothered me is I think he's too either rigid or loyal to his guys. When he won those 2 Stanley Cups, he was playing younger guys, and he was confident, okay, they don't have experience.
They were playing well, though. A lot of guys they brought up over the course of the year haven't played all that
He
well.
had better younger guys than he has.
Well, I'm just saying there had to be an opportunity at some point this year for O'Connor to get more of a look, and for even P.O. Joseph to get more of an opportunity.
But you're comparing like Jake Gensel to O'Connor or Brian
Not
Rust
like
or
Tom
some of these young
Kuhnhackl or guys
like
that. Brian Rust wasn't considered a huge prospect. What was he, a 3rd-round pick?
Yeah, but he played well when he got the call. So did Wilson. So did
O'Connor wasn't even drafted.
All those
and
guys.
I think you're bringing this up, Pony, because I'm trying to read your mind here. Brian Boyle has not looked good in this series.
No, he hasn't.
He made 1 play on the Rodriguez goal yesterday, which was a nice play. He was also the reason it was a 3-on-2 for the Rangers on their first goal because he couldn't get back. He looks so slow in this series. I would have gone with O'Connor as well. I'm a little surprised that wasn't the case. If Raquel can play in Game 4, and he has skated a couple of days in a row, I have to think Boyle's the next guy out.
All right, Jeff, let's talk about this now. You got secondary scoring. It's been the big claim all season. Where is it? Well, we saw a lot of it. In fact, 6 of the 7 goals were scored by guys not named. Crosby, Gensel got an empty netter. Rust. How important was that, and do you think it carries on?
It was huge. And, Sullivan was right. He was saying, hey, we're knocking at the door of getting some secondary scoring. And
I didn't believe it.
He wasn't lying. He was right. They got exactly what they needed. Listen, if they get scoring like that, they're going to be very successful. But if they can get pressure from other lines, and then if their PK may have turned a corner, their special teams can turn a corner, I really like them in this series.
We've talked about the Penguins now for almost 10 minutes. I have to say this. Sidney Crosby has looked like the best player in the world. Someone needs to raise their hand on this set and make that point.
What he did in the 3rd period last night, he wasn't that great in the first 2 periods
I agree with that.
compared to how he played in New York. In the 3rd period, that was old school, vintage Sid. What he was doing behind the net, the way he was controlling play.
He turned Keandre Miller inside out.
We haven't seen that from him in years. That just tells you how hungry he is to make one last run.
And to Josh's point, was there something said in the second intermission, or were they following what Crosby was doing on the ice, and maybe that was leading them as much as any conversation?
I just think if you're going to advance in this thing, you need your stars to be stars. They went out early because they weren't getting scoring from Sid and Gensel and those guys last year, and now they are. So to me, the great equalizer is either New York's goaltender steps up, or they start to get scoring from their stars in this series.
All right, so I expect New York to have a bounce back. They have to. I mean,
no, they don't. They can lose 5-1.
No, I think they'll have a bounce. I think they'll play well. What I'm saying is they're going to play better than they have consistently, and I think you'll see some of the games we saw early in the season. Josh, who wins the series, and how many games will it take?
I picked the Rangers in 6 a week ago.
Come on, change your pick, Josh.
The way Crosby looks right now, I'm going to go Pittsburgh in 6. I just have a feeling I do.
Oh, I've been saying Penguins. I said Penguins in 6 from the beginning because I believe in King Domingue.
But you didn't know King Domingue was going to be in.
Well, I said he was going to.
You had no idea.
Oh, I've been a Louis Domingue guy for a long time.
For many years, Louis Domingue guy here.
I said Rangers in 6 as well. I still want to see a little more before. I'm going to say Rangers in 7 now.
Bob, how about
I had
you?
Rangers in 7 was my series pick.
You want to flip-flop?
No, because I still think the Rangers are going to show you a lot of what we saw in the regular season. I think there'll be a counter response. I think it'll be a great series.
It is a great series.
And it'll lead to the question, Josh, real quick. I don't know how much time we have left for this, but what happens if they lose in the first round? Let's make it a minute if we can. Quick answers.
There will be significant changes in the organization. It all goes back to Letang and Malkin. There's no way they're both coming back.
No way.
I'm starting to wonder if either one comes back at this point. Malkin, I know he scored the goal. That was great. He hasn't looked great in this series. It's going to be hard to give him a 3 or 4 year contract with the money he will make. They will spend a lot of money next year. It might not be on these 2 guys, though.
Well, see, I could live with that. If you're telling me that they're going to out with the old, in with the new, they're still going to spend to the cap and try to be a championship team just with different faces, I could sign up for that.
And I think that might be the plan.
I think it depends on how it ends. Does it end because they don't have Tristan Jarry and Domingue really struggles down the stretch, and that's the reason that they're out, and maybe another injury plays a factor? But there will be changes, and I agree with Josh, especially with Malkin. I know he won't command the same salary that he has now.
Why not?
Because he's not the same player.
Not the same player.
There's 31 other teams, guys, who are trying to sell tickets, though. I think someone like him.
Is he a big enough draw?
He said he's a rich guy. He doesn't need the money anymore. So
right.
we'll see if he lives up to that.
I think the question is, would you sign him for $5 million or something along those lines?
I would in a second for
I would.
5.
For 6, I would. We got to take a break. When we come back, Devin Bush did not get the 5th-year option. We'll debate right here on the #1 Cochran Sports Showdown.